Okay, hi, my name is Rona Elliott, and I welcome you with all my heart, especially the new guests, to the Friday Night Golden Door Speaker Series. As you heard from Kathy, this is kind of a new adventure for us, and we are thrilled to be sharing this with you and to be bringing the Golden Door guests, interesting and incredible people who we hope can enhance your lives the way the experience of the Golden Door is. And tonight I am thrilled to be introducing a longtime friend of mine, Lynne Twist. I know some of you have heard about some of her accomplishments, but I'm going to read some of them because even in the face of sitting here in front of her, I stand in awe of what she has accomplished in her lifetime. She's modest, so she's a global visionary committed to alleviating poverty and hunger, and has always raised money for the great issues of our time. She spent over 40 years in the world of ending hunger. She includes ending hunger, supporting social justice and environmental sustainability. She's worked with Mother Teresa in Calcutta, in refugee camps in Ethiopia. She's worked with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Bishop Tutu, Maya Angelou. She's been given every award under the sun. She works with indigenous people throughout the world. She's worked in more than 50 countries and raised over $150 million for various causes. No one will ask you for money here tonight. By her own description, she is both a fundraiser and a philanthropist. And it's through her sacred work of fundraising and philanthropy that's provided the insights Lynne has developed into the unique relationship between people and money. And that's really what we're going to be talking about tonight. She has an unbelievable insight into money. Her best-selling and award-winning book, The Soul of Money, which is in the back of the room, and her institute, The Soul of Money, has shed light on the distorted and difficult and untransformed relationships people have with money. So that's whether you have money or don't have money, or you live in a culture in which money doesn't even exist. Is that fair to say? I've described it pretty well. So first, why don't you tell us about the Soul of Money and where the impetus for it came from, and about the Institute?
Well, let's see. The Soul of Money is a book, and I'm really, you could say, I call myself a pro-activist, which is a way of talking about activism for a vision rather than against anything. So I'm not against anything, I'm for a new vision for our world. And I've been engaged, as you said, Rona, in all of these different topics, particularly ending world hunger, consciousness raising, and now the environmental movement and social justice movements. And I have learned a whole lot about people and money. I didn't really kind of set out to do that, but when you spend time with someone like Mother Teresa and watch the way she works with the poorest of the poor. And Mother Teresa, by the way, was an extraordinary fundraiser. No one thinks of her that way, but she was. Works with, now I work with indigenous peoples of the Amazon who don't even know money exists. They don't, they're just learning about it, and they don't understand it because it doesn't grow on trees and it does not fall from heaven, and it's an invention. That we've kind of forgot that we made it up, but they're just learning about it now. You see a lot about money, and the anguish and suffering and upset and difficulty that most people, not everybody, have around money. It just fascinated me. And so in working with, I always like to say people I used to call poor, and I don't call people poor any longer because I've worked with them, I know them. I've been side by side with women in Ethiopia after the 1984-1985 famine with my hands in the dirt. And when you with people who've been through that kind of trauma, or in Mozambique after the Civil War, you realize there's nothing poor about them. They're incredibly strong, incredibly resilient, unbelievably creative, really intelligent. They may not know how to read or write, but that's because they've never been given that opportunity. So there's nothing, and they exhibit more courage to live through one day than most of us are going to need in our lifetime. So to call them poor is to demean them and to demean those of us who would look at them that way, rather than recognizing that what's poor is their circumstances. In many cases, the circumstances into which they were born. but they are whole and complete people living in the tyranny of oppressive or resource-poor circumstances. So to label them poor is a misnomer. And I've also had the great privilege of working with many of our global billionaires. When you're working on giant global issues like I am, you have conversations with some of the wealthiest people on earth. And I know that also, I used to call those people rich, people like all of us here. But when we call ourselves rich, we also describe ourselves by our circumstances, even if we created them, in a way that we sometimes, it's confusing, because we're whole and complete people living in wealthy or incredibly bountiful circumstances. And sometimes people relate to people of wealth in ways that is difficult. They don't know who your friends are, really. So I've realized that these two extremes, which has been a huge gift in my life, and then all of us in between, has taught me a lot about our challenging and difficult relationship with money. And not everybody has a difficult relationship with money. Probably the people here don't, but most people do. And even some of our wealthiest families have huge, challenges in raising children in a way that they turn out pretty normal.
Well, let's talk about why does money create suffering, sort of in a generic way, in a way you would describe it.
I don't think money creates suffering. I actually think the suffering lives in our culture. The culture of money, which is so intense and so powerful, that we have given money more power in many ways than human life. And we all know that that's not valid, that's not true. There's nobody here who would say that money's more important than your relationship with your children or your wife or your mother or your sister or your friends. But our culture behaves, kind of engenders people's behavior to put money ahead of human life. And you can see that in the way that people behave. We won't talk to someone that we love, like a brother or a sister, over a money issue for sometimes years, which says the money's more important than that relationship. Except we know that's not really true. But that's valid in our culture. We won't talk to an ex-husband or an ex-wife, sometimes for the rest of our life, over a money issue, have custody battles over kids. These are things that are valid in our culture, but not really valid and true to who we are as a human family. So the culture of money has so much power and such a grip on kind of like everybody, people of great wealth and people who are striving to pay the rent, that it kind of hijacks our soul sometimes. That's why I call my book The Soul of Money, because I know money doesn't have a soul, but we do. And we can use money, earn money, spend money, invest money, and contribute money in a way that gives it soul and meaning, rather than kind of sell out our own soul to acquire it. And so I've been lucky enough to really get intimately involved with some of the wealthiest families in the world, and also some of the poorest and most resource poor, people in the world. And I've learned a lot from that.
Well, why don't you just share some stories about a family of wealth where a shift took place in your work with them that allowed them to perhaps see or experience it or use their resources in a different way that had an unintended consequence at the beginning.
Gosh, which story to tell? Well, one very dramatic one was in Australia. An extremely wealthy family, one of the wealthiest families in Australia. They read the book, The Soul of Money. One or two of the younger people in the family in their 30s read the Soul of Money book, and they contacted me and said, we have a huge schism in our family over Israel. And we need help. And the fact that we're so wealthy has exacerbated and expanded this problem. And really interesting family, beautiful people. And the eldest people in the family were Holocaust survivors. So they had a huge commitment to Israel. And they had both been in refugee camps, one in Dachau, not refugee camps, the horrible concentration camps, one in Dachau and one in Treblinka. And they had been liberated by the Allies. Their parents were gone, their whole families were gone. They were liberated as children, and they somehow ended up in Australia. They met each other, married, and created a gigantic fortune in the service of Israel. That was really what drove the fortune. And they're in their 70s now, 80s actually, let me think. And the next generation down was sort of with the program, but the next generation down felt uncomfortable with this huge fortune, all the investments, everything devoted to Israel. They were like, arguing about it. This is, well, what about the environment? What about the Palestinians? What about, what about other stuff? We're not so sure about Israel. And it was just a tremendously emotional schism in the family, given the Holocaust survivors generated the money. So I worked with them, actually, it took 2 years, so it wasn't fast. But we had what I'd call incredibly challenging and I'll say transformational sessions over those 2 years, where everybody was actually able to hear the other person's point of view and realize that there's a distinction between a point of view and vision. A point of view, so for example, I had a wonderful conversation with John over dinner. You have a point of view of this room. You can see it from where you're sitting. So you see the room from a certain point of view. And it's true and valid for you. But it's a completely different point of view for Philip, who's at the end of the table, who I've known for years, or one of you gentlemen over here, or Jeff sitting in the back. You have a different point of view. And we think our point of view sometimes is the only point of view. We don't realize there are many points of view and they're all valid. And when you come from vision rather than a point of view, you can accept the points of view. You can allow them. You can let them relax. People don't have to fight for their point of view, especially if they're received and heard and acknowledged. And you could say that's what we did. We realized that everybody had their point of view from the different places, almost geographically, on the game board of the issues that they cared about, but all of them had the same vision. The vision being all people deserve a chance for a healthy and productive life. And so that vision was almost like higher than the points of view on the game board. And once they really realized that they were aligned, they didn't agree, but they were aligned, if I can put it that way, the whole thing, the juggernaut, broke open. There were beautiful tears of anger at first and emotion, but then tears of joy and being moved by, I never really thought of it in that way. And so the way that they are now doing their philanthropy, their investing, is transformed, I would say. Not changed, but transformed. Everybody has the freedom to stand for what they believe in, and everyone's view is respected. And it's much more diversified. And the people who care deeply about Israel still very, very, very deeply funding Israel. And the rest of the family who aren't so sure about that's their thing have the freedom to do what they want. So that was a very dramatic example.
Right. Now, I remember reading, and I remember you speaking of having worked with Mother Teresa, and that she opened a window for you, so to speak, talking about the fact that people who had money needed compassion because they were suffering too.
Yeah, she was something, Mother Teresa, you can imagine. She was a little tiny person. We all know that. You just think of her and you can see her image, a little 4'3" woman. But my first meeting with her totally changed my life. And I was raised as a Catholic. So meeting Mother Teresa was like meeting God practically. And I had considered becoming a nun when I was in high school. She was my hero, my heroine. And when I started working on hunger and poverty with the Hunger Project, I found myself in India. I was very deeply engaged in hunger issues and poverty issues in India, and a friend that I was working with, an Indian friend, Indira Koitras, said, I'm going to see Mother Teresa today. Would you like to meet her? And I almost fainted. I was so excited. And then the meeting got canceled and it didn't happen. But I said to Indira, if there's any way you could ever introduce me. And so she said she would, and a whole series of things happened to rearrange life so that I actually had that opportunity. And when I went to see her, I saw her in her orphanage in Delhi, and in Old Delhi. And when I approached the doorway, if you can picture this, to the orphanage, which is in the old city of Delhi, if you've been there. I walked across a courtyard, and the courtyard was stone and in a very, very depressed area of Old Delhi. And there was this wonderful picture over the doorway of the Missionaries of Charity, the blue and white saris of the nuns. And it said Missionaries of Charities, and I approached the door and was so excited. And on the doorstep was a crumpled up piece of newspaper, and I'll never forget this. And I'm sort of a trash picker-upper, so I picked it up, and inside there was a baby, a human being, the smallest human being I have ever seen in my entire life. It was a little girl. She was the size of my hand. I'm not kidding. Like the size of a puppy or something, so small. And I was just, it makes me cry to think about it now. And she was breathing, she was alive. And I took the shawl I had it on, and I wrapped it, took her out of the newspaper, wrapped my shawl around her, and she just was like this tiny thing inside of that. And I brought her into the orphanage, and this was an orphanage for girls under 2, which are often unwanted in India, especially at that time. And I handed this little tiny human being to the nun who greeted me, and I said, "I'm here to see Mother Teresa." And the nun said, "Well, I'm sorry, she's not here. She's gone to the jail to bail out some young prostitutes who lost their way because we need some extra hands around here, and we're hoping that they'll move in with us and help us." And I walked into that place, and there were 39 iron cribs with little baby girls in all of these cribs, and then like gymnastic mats on the floor with little babies on the floor. All of the children were under 2, and they were all girls except for one boy. Some of them deformed, some of them blind. All of them had been abandoned. And so the woman said, "She's not here. I don't know when she'll be back. I think she's forgotten about your appointment, but would you help us?" And I said, "Oh my God, of course." So I rolled up my sleeves, and they gave me an apron, and I started bathing little ones, little blind baby girls and little deformed, weird little deformed babies. And it was, I don't know how long I was doing this. I was at this like big tub. And I was so inspired and so moved, I forgot about Mother Teresa. It was like the most incredible place in the world. There was so much love there. And I remember one thing that I'd read about Mother Teresa. She said, "To know me is to know my work." So this was my meeting with Mother Teresa. And then someone tapped me on the shoulder, and they said, "She's here, she's waiting for you." So I walked, put my little charges down, gave them to another one of the nuns, and I walked down a long corridor, and there was a table with 2 chairs, just a plain wooden table in a long hallway, and they sat me down at the table. And then I looked down the hall, and there she was coming towards me. And that figure, that tiny, bent over, beautiful being coming down the hall with her. She had a Labrador retriever, an old, Labrador with a little gray beard. And I stood up and walked towards her, and I kneeled in front of her, and I bowed. I wanted to kiss her feet. I wasn't sure, what do you do when you meet Mother Teresa, And she just said, "Stand up, come on, let's go sit down." She was so generous. And we sat down, and I had this conversation with her, which I can't remember actually, because I cried through the whole thing. I was so overwhelmed to be in the presence of what was so clearly a living saint. And we had a conversation about hunger and poverty and the work that I was doing, and a little bit about money actually, but not much. And then there was a scuffle behind me, a very loud scuffle, and loud, angry, kind of obnoxious voices. And these 2 immense human beings came down the hall towards Mother Teresa and me. And it was an Indian couple, a very, very large man. I can't remember, this, I'm sure I'm exaggerating, but he looked like the biggest human being I've ever seen in my life. He was huge. He was a Sikh. He had a white turban on and a big topaz right here. And he had a brocade kurta over his very large belly. Kurta is the men's clothing. And he had a ring, I remember this, on every single finger on his left hand, every single, including his thumb. And he was he had a beard, and he was kind of smelly, over-perfumed, and loud, and big, and I don't know, I don't like him at all. And with him was this woman, and she was, she had this kind of gold sari on. She was kind of overweight, and she was sort of bulging out of her clothes, and she had a diamond in her nose, and then diamonds that went all the way to her ear, like big ones, and bangles and rings, and they were just like decked out. And she was over made up, she was overweight, she was overdone, she was over the top, everything over the top. And she had on really strong perfume that was like, it was just disgusting. So they came in and they were so obnoxious, and I can't do an Indian accent, but if I could, I would do it. They said, "Mother Teresa, we didn't get the picture." And I didn't know what they were talking about, and so she stood up, and the woman handed me a camera. This is in 1981. We didn't have cell phones then. She handed me the camera, this woman. She said, "Take the picture." And they didn't say hello or anything. They were just loud and awful. And she sort of grabbed Mother Teresa. It seems to me that she grabbed her. Now, I may be overstating this, and she sort of pulled her over to the wall. So here's this gigantic man and this gigantic woman and little Mother Teresa around here in the middle, and me with the camera. And I wanted to, shoot these people, not with the camera, but with something else. And the woman said, "Take the picture." And so I clicked the picture, and then this woman did this horrible thing. Here's Mother Teresa. She had osteoporosis. She was bent over like this. The woman put her hand under Mother Teresa's chin like this. "Chin up, Mother Teresa," like this, and held her head up like that, and asked me to take another picture, which I did. Then they left. They didn't say thank you. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't embrace her. They were awful. I hated these people. I hated them. I was so furious, and the blood was bursting through my veins, and I just, And Mother Teresa was fine, and she sat down, and I sat down, and I remember my heart was pounding. I thought, I won't say what I was about to say there, and then she continued the meeting as if this had not happened, and I tried to calm down, and then we closed, and she gave me a scapular medal, and I asked her to pray for my mother, who was sick at the time, and she wrote a little note to my mother on her card, and she was just as kind and as loving as you can possibly imagine. And so we completed our meeting. I embraced her, walked out, I got in my little taxi to go back to New Delhi, to my hotel, and the whole way I was just boiling. And then I had this complete realization that I had been in the presence of the most incredible unconditional love I'd ever known in my life when I was sitting across from her. I'm not kidding. And then the most intense hate that I'd ever known in my life. And I wrote to her, and she was the same all the way through, even. She saw Christ in every face, and I'm not kidding. She saw Christ in those people, and I couldn't see it. And I wrote her a letter and said, I've always, my heart has always gone out to the poor, to the underserved, to the people who need help. And I realized when I was in that meeting with you that I have something about people with enormous wealth and entitlement and privilege that is, they're not okay with me. And I saw how you saw Christ in them too. And I will never forget that. And I want to thank you. That was the greatest teaching I've had in my life. And she wrote me back. So Mother Teresa wrote back in her own hand, by the way. She handwrote her letters. And she said to me, "You have a natural love. Your circle of compassion includes lepers." I had gone with her to the leprosy center after that. Your circle of compassion includes the less fortunate. But the circle of compassion you must extend to the great circles of wealth, because the vicious cycle of wealth can be as challenging, as intractable, with as much suffering for some people as the vicious cycle of poverty. And I invite you to expand your circle of compassion, your circle of love, to include people of wealth who need your love, who need your compassion, and to whom you can do a great service. So I have this letter, and I I accepted the challenge. And so for many years since then, that was 1981, I have been drawn to, I have been invited in, I have been like coming here. I mean, just, I'm a pro-activist. I work on stuff. But to be invited here to sit with you, Rona, and to meet gentlemen of your caliber, and I'm sure you're incredibly prosperous human beings, that you've done enormous things with your life. I'd love to hear from each one of you. And to have the opportunity to be in any way of service to you, make a difference in your life, has been her charge to me. So that's my Mother Teresa story.
Wow. Well, so speaking to that, everyone here who comes here, myself included, has money. How do we approach our resources to ensure that we have our mental health, but also our spiritual health?
Oh gosh, that's a big question. I think it's just different for every single human being. I mean, but if there's one fundamental truth, I would say it's gratitude. I now study with Brother David Steindl-Ras, the great Benedictine monk, who's the living embodiment of gratefulness. He writes on gratefulness. He has an exquisite website called gratefulness.org. And he teaches that gratefulness will transform, gratitude and gratefulness will transform any situation, any trouble, any challenge. And it sounds so simple, kind of like too simple, but it's true. And he says you can live, every human being, no matter what their circumstances, can live in the two branches of gratitude. And I remember asking him, well, what does that mean, the two branches of gratitude? And let me tell you what he said, because it's pretty amazing. He said, the two branches of gratitude are gratefulness and thanksgiving. Gratefulness is the experience of life when the bowl of life is so full that it's almost overflowing, but not quite. The bowl of life is so full that it's kind of bowed at the top, but not yet dribbling over the edges. And that's the experience of the great fullness of life. And when you're in the great fullness of life, you're one with God, you're one with the universe, and there is no other. And that is so fulfilling that it overflows the bowl of life and puts you in the other branch of gratitude, thanksgiving. And when you're in the bowl of life called thanksgiving, the bowl of life is a fountain of bounty. And you're so grateful that there's an other, because all you want to do is give and serve and contribute and share. And that's so fulfilling that puts you over here in the great fullness of life. And for Brother David, the opportunity to realize that if we live in the two branches of gratitude, that is a way of living no matter what our circumstances, particularly people who live with great bounty, and to teach our children to recognize that no matter what comes our way, do we deserve it? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe it's just the gift, the constant bounty and gifts of the universe for which we have the great privilege of being constantly grateful, rather than thinking that we are privileged or that we deserve it or there's something special about us. Rather to just know that to be blessed is to have the opportunity to bless. And for me, that's been very, very powerful for philanthropy, because the people I work with are almost all philanthropists or striving to be better philanthropists. And the word philanthropy means love of humankind. That's what it means. It doesn't actually refer to wealth. It means love of humankind. So everybody is one. Everybody's a philanthropist.
And if you want to, though, become a philanthropist, let's say you're successful, what is the path? How do you find out where that philanthropy resides in you and where it should go, based on your experience?
Well, gosh, I'm sure everybody here is, so I don't want to be bringing coals to Newcastle, but I think where you can feel it in your body, in your heart. When you're moved, it's physical. It's both emotional, it's spiritual, it's something happens. You know, the hair stands up on your arms. You get, in my case, I get a little teary, as you could see. Maybe the experience for men is a little different, but when something really moves you, there's something to that. That's trustworthy. And then it needs to make sense to the mind. You know, you need to do your due diligence and make sure you're not being hooked by something that's not appropriate. But for me, that's the true test. And when people are touched, when people are moved, when people are inspired, it transcends kind of everything else. And I think that's trustworthy. And then you obviously need to do the work that has it make sense, financial sense, and emotional sense, and, you know, good sense, of course. But where, you know, Brother David says this other wonderful thing. He says the open hand is the hand that gives. It's the posture of the hand that gives. And the open hand is also the posture of the hand that receives. And it's when those fingers start to curl that we begin the formation of the fist. And that's the source of all violence, is not allowing the open hand of giving and receiving and letting things flow. So when we're touched, when we're moved, something opens in us. And I think that's when you know you're onto something that's meaningful for you, and that your own financial resources that come through your life, you could say, and I know people do a huge amount of work to earn them, but it's a current. That's why it's called a currency. Money is like water. When it flows consciously, it nourishes, it cleanses, it purifies, it makes things grow. When it's hoarded or held inappropriately or unconsciously with greed, just like water, it becomes toxic and stagnant to those who are holding on to it. And it can, you know, it can cause all kinds of problems. And some of the great families that I've worked with, where the fear of losing it is greater than the joy of being able to share it, it makes them sick. And so I can't remember your question, but am I answering it?
Totally, totally. Okay, so you've done, for many decades, you've taken people down and you work with indigenous tribes, if that's the correct way of saying it, down in the Amazon. And that actually all pulls together in terms of money and resources. So would you just talk a little bit about that world and how it refers back to the world that we're in, the conversation we're having about money here?
Well, it's interesting. I was, you know, wondering how we would do this interview, because it seems like that doesn't really make sense, that suddenly now I'm in the Amazon rainforest working with indigenous people. But there is a through line in every life, and there's a through line in mine. And after working on hunger and poverty for 25 years, I got a whole series of visions and dreams that were quite mystical and quite powerful, and there were also some practical things that happened that took me on what I thought would be a one and only trip to see the Achuar people, who were an uncontacted tribe in the Amazon. And the encounter my husband and I had with them deep in the most remote region of the sacred headwaters of the Amazon in Ecuador totally changed our lives. And what was missing in my life was a deep and profound connection with the natural world. I didn't really have that. And here were people who not only have that, they are the natural world. They live in incredible communion with the natural world. They weren't poor, they weren't sick, they weren't needy, they were prosperous, they were healthy, they had incredibly healthy functional relationships with one another and with their kin, all other species. They needed nothing, and they were the happiest, most content human beings I had ever met. And they had no money. They didn't even know about money. When we started to educate them about, you know, when you walk out of the rainforest, you know, you just can't just feed yourself. And they said, money, you can't hunt for it, you can't eat it, why would anybody want it? So for them to have a successful defending of their culture and territory, they asked us to educate them about money. And I ended up being the person to tell people who never even knew money existed about money in a way that they can successfully navigate their relationship with the modern world. And they have, and they are preserving millions of acres of pristine rainforest, and the most remote rainforest on Earth, right on the equator, the most biodiverse ecosystem on this planet, an ecosystem that survived the Ice Age and repopulated life after the Ice Age and cannot be destroyed, and is an ecosystem where there's oil underneath their forest. And so the threats come, and fortunately the threats go. But that work is like the modern money culture and the natural world meeting head on in the middle of the world, in the heart of the Amazon, with these uncontacted people in a way that has been one of the greatest privileges and opportunities of my life. And so I take people like you deep into the Amazon rainforest, and people have a transformational experience over which they never get. The kind of experience you crave, really, you don't know you crave it till you have it, that fills out your relationship with your own life and the life of all that lives around you, not just human life, but this orchid, these grounds, in a way that is simply remarkable. So it's for me, the whole thing makes sense. And I've been very, very lucky to have this chapter of my life be one where I'm being educated very profoundly by Indigenous people and their way of life, not in a way that makes what we're doing wrong, but gives a whole nother lens, a way of seeing to our own lives at a time when we need to kind of re-see our relationship with the natural world, because we're having challenges with making sure that that sticks around for our grandkids and the generations that follow us.
Thank you. If you want to hang out, we're going to be here with Lynne and her books, and if not, I know you have an 8-mile hike in the morning. And thank you, and I hope this was as informative for you as it was for me.